Hello! Today I'm taking a brief look at some characters that comprise a recurring antagonistic foil within Final Fantasy VII. Now, the Turks may seem like a bit of an odd choice for discussion, but much like my recent episode on Professor Hojo, I've always found them a neat, albeit small component that positively contributes to the wider tapestry of Final Fantasy VII. And rather than being simply another villainous foil to sit alongside Sephiroth, Jenova, Rufus, and the rogues gallery of tertiary antagonists such as Scarlet and Heidegger, I've always enjoyed how the Turks are a slightly more autonomous, non-committal set of characters that straddle the realms of villainy and likability within the game, and the wider Final Fantasy VII universe. So the appeal here is that rather than an arbitrary antagonism, the slightly more impartial, albeit ruthless setup of the Turks allows for comedic cutaways as much as it does drama, and balances humorous exposition and non-essential world-building with the standard obstacles of a JRPG, such as side quests and recurring boss battles. Indeed, our first encounter with the Turks in Final Fantasy VII is meeting Reno in the church, which sets the scene for the unique contribution these characters offer to the game, as he has a somewhat menacing, sarcastic presence, echoing shades of the juvenile delinquent subculture that the Japanese refer to as Yanki, which is a culture also explored in various media released around the time of Final Fantasy VII, such as Battle Royale, Blue Spring, and the Bozazuku gangs in the infamous manga Akira. But besides this, Reno also immediately introduces the comedic aspect of the Turks by turning to the Shinra soldiers and telling them to keep off the flowers, which he himself has just trampled all over. And I think this initial interaction crystallises the unique contribution of the Turks to the game story as both a legitimate threat, but also a generally quite amusing minor inclusion. Now, taking a step back and returning to this Japanese analogue of the Yankee subculture, it's also prudent to note the somewhat obvious Yakuza connotations the Turks seem to have, and as such they reside in quite a distinct Japanese convention within this fantasy setting. The black suits, the shady operations thinly veiled as legitimate business, and the strict adherence to a leadership hierarchy all lend themselves to this popular idea of the Japanese syndicates, not to mention this popular belief that most juvenile Yankees on the streets of Japan are affiliated with or eventually graduate into Yakuza membership, which a Japanese friend of mine has dismissed as actually quite an uncommon occurrence. But again, it's still an aspect of this teenage rebellion that's romanticised in various media, not least the aforementioned movie Blue Spring, but also some Takeshi Kitano movies, the Crazy 88 gang in Kill Bill, and so on. So, moving on, within this framework of the Turks, we have a leadership hierarchy that inches into the senior management of Shinra itself, with Tseng lining in directly to Heidegger throughout the events of Final Fantasy VII. And this setup and tumultuous relationship between the Shinra and this particular department of the Turks does have an interesting history, which is touched on in extended compilation material, and most prominently in the events of Before Crisis, where we have Veld, the former leader of the Turks, vying for control in the midst of a chaotic war with Avalanche. And on this note, without wishing to digress or complain, one of my minor frustrations with some of the extended universe Final Fantasy installments is that, they exist across such disparate and often niche media, and Before Crisis is a prime example of this, because it currently only exists as a Japanese-only mobile game, despite being concluded in 2006. So, a minor gripe there, but I imagine there's an appetite to start updating and compiling these tangent games into some re-release or remake bundle. So, shifting back to the events of Final Fantasy VII, we witness this slightly standoffish relationship between the Turks and Heidegger, and one of the things that's interesting about this group is that they each have juxtaposing personalities that contrast, yet also somewhat complement one another, with the talkative Reno and the stoic Rude being an obvious example, but also the dynamic of Tseng as a reserved pragmatic leader also contrasting really well with the loud and inept ridiculousness of Heidegger, and this creates a really interesting dynamic and friction here too. And while the Turks are ostensibly button men who follow orders without sentiment in this original game, it's interesting to see interactions between Tseng and characters like Heidegger and Scarlet, where we can really sense his certain disdain for them by both what he says and also what he leaves unsaid in his thinly veiled professionalism. And while Tseng and various others are presented with a certain coldness in Final Fantasy VII, it's also prudent to note how extended universe material tends to alter these characteristics of the Turks, I think, and make them slightly more empathetic and human, which I'll touch on shortly. Now, in keeping with the juxtaposing dynamics of the characters, let's wind it back and look at Reno and Rude, who are undoubtedly the most prominent representation of the Turks that we get in this game. And I think they were brilliantly crafted as an odd couple, where Reno's antagonistic outspokenness is accompanied by Rude's stoic, unknowable ellipses, which is a dynamic that's carried over and equally well utilised, I think, in the characters of Raijin and Fujin in Final Fantasy VIII, and to a lesser extent, Lani and Amarant in Final Fantasy IX. So, for Reno's part, he's very much a brash, loud character with a slightly Bishonen androgyny who contrasts heavily with his partner Rude, who is very much an imposing, utilitarian-looking character, and the strong silent type, if you like. And where Reno clearly thinks a lot of himself, often describing himself in the third person as Reno of the Turks, and frequently telling the party how they're in for it, Rude merely accents the sentiments expressed by Reno with short and intermittent sentences, which is again something similar to Fujin's solitary caps lock expressions, which accompanies Raijin in Final Fantasy VIII. So, through Reno and Rude, we also witness the non-committal nature of the Turks, not least because they're often optional battle encounters, and we don't have to fight Reno or Rude by necessity more than a couple of times in the game. But beyond this, when we do encounter them, they're often discussing events in a very nonchalant, off-topic way, and where Heidegger, Scarlet, and various other members of the Shinra are often going out of their way to apprehend Cloud & Co., and it's basically their main pursuit in this game, we have Reno and Rude discussing who they're more attracted to between Aerith and Tifa when we see them at Gongaga, or outrightly declining to fight Cloud when they are on vacation in Wutai. And indeed, there's even a Wutai side quest where we see them temporarily join forces with Cloud to apprehend the mutual enemy, Don Canio. And so we see the certain impartiality which, combined with their ruthless demeanour and intriguing characteristics, make the Turks an appealing component of Final Fantasy VII, where they don't quite fit the mould of a conventional villain, but also they're very far from the hero archetype we might assume as well. Now, on this note, it's interesting to consider the somewhat controversial appearances the Turks have made since Final Fantasy VII, and how the coldness and ruthlessness of the characters has shifted into a more humane, comical, and light-hearted disposition, with particular criticism being levelled at Reno and Rude's appearance in Advent Children. And the most common arguments to this end are that Square, or some combination of Tetsuya Nomura or Kazushige Najima, identified the positive reception these minor characters had received following the original game, and so they opted to inflate their role for subsequent appearances, which had many fans feeling that it was quite a contrived and cynical effort to make fan favourites of them, and put them in roles that they wouldn't naturally appear in, to capitalise on their appeal. Now, for my part, and regarding Advent Children specifically, I think the general scenario of Reno and Rude retaining their allegiance to Rufus, or at the very least Tseng, does make sense from a story perspective, and it does hold true to the original game. And even their tenuous allegiance to Cloud seems plausible, because it echoes shades of the common goal they shared during the Don Canio segment at Wutai. But I think the core criticism of Advent Children resides in attempting to make heroes, or at the very least prominent anti-heroes, out of characters who are for all intents and purposes, bad people. And they're appealing precisely because they are quite ruthless, uncaring, and mildly sadistic people. And the way the writers went about this in the movie was primarily to soften them up and make Reno a slightly more light-hearted, slapstick character, which contradicts his original appearance in Final Fantasy VII. And, while Final Fantasy VII saw him as a slightly hapless character, having to flee the party following each battle, for example, he was still a pretty sadistic, cold-hearted individual who relished the opportunity to drop Don Corneo off a cliff, for example. And I think many found his slightly more playful, goofy disposition in Advent Children a complete U-turn on the more menacing aspects of his character. Now, some have made a similar argument for Tseng in Crisis Core, and while I personally found him, to retain much of the pragmatic reserve that we see in Final Fantasy VII proper, and we could put his comparative warmth in Crisis Core down to his necessary friendship with Zack and Aerith, and his slightly more youthful years, I can sort of see where the argument comes from here, because being a Turk supersedes everything for Tseng, and his warming to others in Crisis Core obviously conflicts with this, and it makes some of his actions in the original game, particularly the rather jarring smack in the mouth he gives Aerith, seem all the more vulgar and gratuitous than it already is. Having said that, however, I think the intrigue around Tseng's entire character arc is about trying to maintain a facade of not caring about anything, when in fact he probably does. And while this is hinted at in the original game, and it makes sense when we look back at the historic conflict between the Shinra and the Turks, and particularly Tseng's dismay at some of the orders he's given, it has much more clarity in Crisis Core when we see these early friendships being fostered between himself and other significant characters. And we understand that his subsequent agenda is more about carefully balancing the personal with the professional, and while he's not actively undermining his employers or his commitment to the Turks, he's certainly operating in grey areas of the instructions that he's given, which makes him quite an interesting character, I think. But, having said that, I know there's plenty of discussion existing around this and Tseng's story, because he's equally accused of being either retconned or poorly written, for those that dismiss it. And this regards both his appearance in Crisis Core and his subsequent appearance in Advent Children, which some believe was a retcon as well. Now, the only prominent Turks I haven't really considered from the main game are Elena and Vincent Valentine. And regarding Vincent, his role as a Turk is good exposition, I think, and it's world building that draws his relevance closer to the game events than it otherwise would have been. And I think this is generally pretty solid, with his history around Hojo and Lucrezia being quite an interesting element that supports his status as a secret character, but, it doesn't impose him too much on the central story, and he sits comfortably on the peripheries there. And indeed, actually returning to this idea of the Turks as villainous, violent yes-men, it plays perfectly to Vincent's catatonic desire to repent, and these numerous weighty sins he describes does seem relevant to his role as a former Turk, because besides losing Lucrezia, the acts he would have perpetrated in his day job clearly would have been pretty dubious in nature, and I imagine contribute heavily to the regrets that he feels. Moving on finally to Elena, she is often seen as a second fiddle to Reno and Rude, but returning to this idea of contrasting characters within the framework of the Turks, I think she's a great foil to the blasé, borderline non-committal laziness of her two comrades, and the retentive stoicism of her leader, Tseng. And while her gutsy over-enthusiasm and rookie status often make her the subject of ridicule among her colleagues, her eagerness to apprehend Cloud & Co. is probably what the Turks should be doing in the first place. But as we often see, Reno is amusingly trying to educate her in the art of assuaging responsibilities wherever possible. And I think because of this, she's a great component of the Turks that emphasises the non-committal nature of the group that I alluded to earlier. So, as I stated in the beginning, the Turks are only a small component of the original game, but they are really great at showing the full ensemble spectrum of events. And rather than being, a simple story of good guys versus bad guys, Final Fantasy VII is comprised of many moving parts and factions with differing opinions, allegiances, and end goals, of which the Turks are a fantastic example. Regarding the imminence of the remake, it will be interesting to see what's retained, retconned, or outrightly changed about the Turks, considering the different perspectives we've been offered of them across the compilation material, and whether they're going to slip further out of the menacing villainy of the original game and more into this murky area of comical reprieve and, buddying up with Cloud, as we've seen in Advent Children. So, there we have it. That about wraps up my brief thoughts on the Turks, who I just really felt were relevant to discuss because they rarely are, and I think they're a great aspect of Final Fantasy VII proper. So, if you got this far, thanks very much for listening, and I hope you enjoyed it. And feel free to drop a comment, share your thoughts. And as always, if you enjoy the channel, feel free to share on your forums, social channels, and so on. And as always, you can subscribe to keep updated with my latest posts.